My name is Margaret Hale. I am 72 years old, a retired school bursar who balanced ledgers by hand before computers were common. And I learned a long time ago that numbers do not lie even when people do, which is why when my daughter-in-law Vanessa called me useless and siphoned my pension into an account I did not recognize, I walked into the bank with my cane clicking like a metronome and froze every last family account attached to my name as co-signer while she watched the teller screen turn red and screamed loud enough to shake the glass doors, because that was the moment I stopped being quiet. Will you judge me before you hear why I did it? The manager tried to usher us into a private room, but Vanessa's voice sliced the lobby, calling me a thief, calling me senile, calling me a burden we didn't ask for. And I stood there, small but steady, feeling the ground of 72 years under my shoes as the young teller whispered, "Ma'am, the blocks are in place," and I nodded without blinking. Because a woman who has counted the coins in a classroom biscuit tin knows when a hand that isn't hers is dipping in, even if that hand calls her mother. Did you ever notice how insult feels like a slap that doesn't leave a bruise? She lunged for my purse. My son Daniel arrived breathless from the car park, face gray with confusion, asking what was happening, and I handed him the printed statements where my name sat politely beside transfers labeled household consolidation. Little rivers of my pension redirected into Vanessa's rainy day fund that somehow lived only in her name, and he stared at the page like it was a language he didn't speak. Because love makes smart men slow, doesn't it? Unfreeze it, Vanessa hissed, panting, while the manager cleared his throat and said, "We'll need both co-signers to reverse this," and my son turned between us the way little boys do when two parents quarrel, except the boy was 42 and the parents were me and the woman who promised to love him, for richer or poorer. Which is an oath that sounds different when it's my coins on the table, doesn't it? I did not raise my voice. I let the silence carry the weight of what she had taken, because when indigence threatens an old woman, people expect wailing and not arithmetic. And the arithmetic said that in 6 months, my rent at the assisted living facility would bounce, my medications would be delayed, and the little envelope I send every term to a student named Grace for her school fees would be empty, which is a kind of death too, isn't it? Vanessa called me useless, a word that sticks like gum in your hair, and something inside me that had bowed for years. After the stroke stole my husband's speech, after cancer took my sister, after Daniel's mortgage swallowed his laughter, finally straightened its spine, and I said, "I am many things, Vanessa, but I am not careless with numbers," and the bank lights flickered in the air conditioning like a stage cue, which felt fitting for what would follow, don't you think? The security guard, kind eyes behind thick glasses, asked if we'd like water. I shook my head and kept my cane planted, because steadiness is an old woman's sword, and the manager asked whether I wanted to proceed with a formal complaint, and I thought of the first time I held my pension card, the way my hands trembled with relief that I would not have to ask anyone for salt or soap again, and I said, "Yes, because a line must be drawn where dignity begins, right?" Daniel looked at me, then at his wife, then at the ceiling as if answers might be written in white paint, and he whispered, "Mom, tell me this isn't what it looks like," and I felt my heart rend in two. The part that once buttoned his school shirt with one hand while stirring porridge with the other, and the part that learned to keep receipts in a Ziploc bag. Because sometimes motherhood demands that you be the wall your child bruises his knuckles on so he doesn't walk off a cliff, wouldn't you? Agree. Vanessa laughed a brittle laugh, said she only reorganized my funds because I kept misplacing passwords, which was funny because she is the one who insisted on setting up those passwords to help, and it struck me that some helps are just prettier cages, and when the manager repeated, "Ma'am, shall I submit the fraud report?" I nodded, feeling the weight of the word fraud like a stone cracking a window, and everyone in the lobby turned to look, as people do when they smell smoke, don't they? The teller stamped papers, the printer hummed, and Vanessa's voice rose into a wail about embarrassment and family loyalty and "after all I've done," and I held Daniel's eyes and said, "We will talk," which is what mothers say when the ground is breaking and you must shepherd your child across the gap, and as the manager escorted us to a side room and closed the glass door, the last thing I heard was Vanessa on the phone barking to someone. She froze everything, "Do something." And that was when I knew this was bigger than a misunderstanding, wasn't it? Now, before I tell you what we found when we opened those statements and how deep the hole really was, let me take you back to the afternoon the first small boundary was crossed with a smile, because big betrayals are only possible where tiny courtesies were accepted and filed away like unpaid debts. And you might ask why I didn't bark then, but you'll decide for yourself when you hear what happened next, won't you? It started with a cup of tea and a compliment, as many thefts of the heart do, because the first time Vanessa said, "Mom, let me help you with your bills. Your hands are too precious to be fiddling with small screens." I felt seen and cared for, the way a tired back welcomes a warm hand, and I said yes, thinking it was an embrace, not a hand sliding into my pocket. And you've said yes to the wrong kindness too, haven't you? Daniel brought her home 11 years ago, eyes bright, voice bigger, and I was happy because a man who smiles with his eyes is usually in good company. And Vanessa was radiant, clever, efficient. In the first month she color-coded the pantry and gifted me a cardigan the exact blue of the sky before rain, and I thought, a daughter at last, because I had only one child and no daughters. And hope can make even a bursar forget to sign the back of a check, can't it? The first boundary was my phone, she said. Passwords are tedious, let me consolidate. And when she read them aloud into the new app, I felt foolish for how many I'd scrawled in a notebook under recipes. But she laughed, kissed my cheek and said, "What would you do without me?" And I thought it was a joke, even though a part of me twinged at the implication, because jokes are often truth in festive clothes, aren't they? Then came the time I moved from my little terrace into assisted living after a fall in the bathroom left bruises like maps on my hips, and Vanessa said she'd optimize my budget so I could afford nicer physio and a better meal plan, and she did. On paper it looked cleaner, smarter, modern. But I noticed the envelope for Grace's school fees went out late one term, and when I asked, Vanessa smiled thinly and said, "We must prioritize." And the words felt like a ruler rapping my knuckles. Don't you feel it? Daniel works long hours as an electrical engineer. He is gentle and stubborn, exactly his father's son, and when bills came, he signed what Vanessa put before him, trusting the way men trust a routine they don't watch, which is how a marriage hums until a pebble in the gears grinds into a rock, and I should have pressed then, but mothers pick their battles like nurses pick veins, carefully, painfully, and sometimes too late, right? Birthdays came and went. I gave Vanessa a bracelet, pearls small as dew, and she gave me a framed print that said, "Family is where life begins and love never ends," which I hung near my bed until the night I realized the first part is true and the second depends on deeds, not frames, because love does end where respect is withdrawn like rent overdue, and respect was about to bounce, wasn't it? The word useless arrived on a Tuesday when I'd called to ask why my streaming service kept declining, and Vanessa sighed into the phone, "Because you keep messing things up." And when I reminded her I hadn't touched the account in months, she said, "Mom, don't start," with a tone that stacked sandbags between us, and I remembered the girl who once brought me sky blue cardigans, and I wondered when kindness turned into a ledger of favors. And maybe it always was one, do you think? 2 weeks later, I overheard her telling a friend on speaker in my living room she'd forgotten to hang up. "Honestly, if we don't take charge now, we'll be stuck funding a retirement home forever, and what about our future?" And something in my chest went cold, because I had been funding my own future for 30 years and I had earmarked money for Grace and for a small garden at the home. And hearing myself reduced to a cost center made me feel like a broken chair in a garage sale. Doesn't that image sting? I started checking statements, slowly at first, then with my old bursar's ferocity, and I saw the household consolidation transfers like weekly bruises, small enough to excuse individually, large enough to harm collectively. And I printed them, slid them into my Ziploc, and waited for a day when my hands were steady and my spine stiffer than my cane, because some confrontations should not be launched from a rocking chair. Wouldn't you agree? When I confronted her at their dining table, she laughed and said, "We're family," as if the word were a key that opened every lock, and when I said no, "Family is a trust, not a license," she rolled her eyes and said to Daniel, "See? Drama." And he rubbed his temples and asked me to be reasonable, and I realized reasonable meant quiet. And I am many things, but I am not quiet when a child of mine is learning to call theft an errand. And that's when I made the bank appointment for Friday, which brings us back to the lobby and her scream, but not yet to the deepest part, because you still don't know who was on the other end of her phone when she hissed, "Do something, do you?" We sat in the small glass room with the manager, a gentleman named Lewis who wore a tie clip shaped like a paperclip, which made me trust him, because people who like tidy tools usually keep tidy consciences, and he laid out the statements like a surgeon presenting scans, lines of numbers that told the story my heart already knew, and each page ended with a total that felt like a confession, and you know how a confession is both relief and ruin, right? He pointed to the pattern. Transfers from my pension on the first Monday of each month into an account labeled Vanessa Emergency, then from there into Homestead Ventures LLC, Then to a mortgage far away in a city we do not live in, and my son's mouth opened and closed like he'd surfaced too fast, because there is drowning in water and there is drowning in evidence, and both steal breath the same way, don't they? Homestead Ventures, Daniel said, voice tinny. What is that? And Vanessa crossed her legs and said, too bright. An investment, and the word rang false even before Lewis said quietly. It's a short-term rental company registered to Mrs. Vanessa Hale and Mr. Colin Drake, and the silence that fell after the other man's name was a new kind of storm over our table, because I have never heard thunder inside a bank before. Have you? Who is Colin? Daniel asked, voice scraping the floor, and Vanessa flicked her hair, said, Don't be dramatic, he's just a partner, and Lewis spared us, adding, a business partner. But the look that crossed Daniel's face was the look of a man who has found a second set of house keys on his spouse's ring, and I wanted to reach for his hand but I kept mine flat on the table, because mothers must let truth do its full work, even when it cuts, wouldn't you? There were emails too. Lewis had them printed from the bank's compliance archive, where Vanessa authorized transfers on behalf of Mrs. Hale who struggles with technology, and she had attached a letter with my signature, except it wasn't my signature. It was a smooth forgery that got the M right and the tail of the T wrong, and my stomach lurched at the intimacy of the lie. Because forgery is handwriting that pretends it raised your child. Doesn't it feel that personal? Daniel stood, paced, sat. Vanessa sprinkled excuses like perfume, light and cloying, saying I would benefit in the long run, that I should be grateful for the yield, that she had to move quickly because opportunities don't wait for the elderly. And every sentence pushed me farther from the woman I thought she was, until I was standing on a cliff edge counting the cost of jumping versus being pushed. And I chose to jump with my eyes open, can you tell? Lewis asked if I wanted to escalate, to involve the police, to pursue charges, and I saw Daniel flinch at the word police. The way good men do when family is about to be spelled in court documents, and I said, not yet. Because I wanted to give my son one chance to anchor himself to truth, and I wanted Vanessa to understand that a grandmother can be a storm no roof can hold when you strip her of shelter. And storms are patient until they aren't, do you follow? We left the bank with the freeze in place and the complaint filed, and in the car park Vanessa hissed, You've ruined everything, and I said, Only what was not honest. And Daniel put his hands on the roof and lowered his head between them like a man under a low doorway he's walked through 1,000 times, only to discover it has dropped an inch, and he said, Give me the night, in a voice that respected no one's schedule, least of all Payne's. And Payne laughed anyway, as it does, right? That evening at the assisted living home, I sat with my neighbor Edith, a widow who collects jokes like buttons, and told her I might have to go to the police tomorrow, and she said, Then do it before guilt writes the report for you. And I smiled because old women are a nation that recognizes its own laws, and I called Grace's mother to say the envelope would not be late again, my voice steady as I promised. And steadiness tastes like raw ginger. Sharp, necessary, unforgettable, doesn't it? At 10:37 p.m., my phone lit with Daniel's name. He sounded exhausted and Young said, Mum, can we meet tomorrow at the house? And I said yes, already laying out my black skirt and the cardigan the color of rain skies, and I slipped the ziplock of papers into my bag, because truth travels best in a clear envelope, and as I turned off the bedside lamp, a car idled outside the facility for a beat too long, lights pooling under my window like questions. And I thought of the voice Vanessa used at the bank, do something, and wondered what something looks like when a person has more nerve than conscience, and that is when my phone buzzed again with a message from an unknown number that read, You've made a mistake, old woman, which I stared at until the screen went dark, because sometimes threats are only mirrors held up to courage, or are they something else tonight? In the morning I took the early bus to Daniel and Vanessa's house with my cane and my ziplock, because I wanted to arrive before words had a chance to dress themselves up as apologies, and the street smelled of wet grass and car wax, a Sunday scent on a weekday, and their front door was ajar, which was odd, because Vanessa is the kind of woman who double-checks locks and posts pictures about home is everything, and the hallway light was on though the sun was up, a detail that felt like a throat clearing, don't you hear it? I stepped inside, called Daniel, called Vanessa, and the only answer was the fridge motor and the clock, tick-tick, like a pencil on a desk before an exam, and on the dining table lay a neat stack of documents in a man's careful hand, Daniel's notes printed from the night before, circles and arrows over Homestead Ventures LC, a list of properties and a sunrise bright posted on top. Mom, wait for me. Don't talk to anyone till I get back. Which is what soldiers say in films before the ambush, isn't it? The back door clicked. I turned to see a tall man in a navy blazer and white smile, the kind of smile that sells insurance, kitchens, and lies, with a folder under his arm, and he said, "Mrs. Hale, I'm Colin Drake, so sorry to drop by unannounced. Vanessa asked me to deliver some paperwork, and the air thinned the way it does at altitude, and I placed my cane between us like a fence as I replied very politely, 'How considerate of you. Because courtesy is a glove you wear while picking up nettles.' And I was about to gather a handful, weren't I?" He set the folder down, fingers a beat too slow to release it, and said, "It's all above board, misunderstandings happen," and I nodded at the folder but kept my eyes on his, because my husband once told me that liars practice their words but rarely their gaze, and Colin's gaze skittered over the room like a moth that knows where the flame is, and just then a car door slammed outside and Vanessa breezed in, lips already forming the word, "Clarify." And I braced for the performance because this was about to be theater with props and guest stars. Can you see the stage lights warming? Daniel was not with her. And the space he should have occupied felt like a missing rung on a ladder I was being forced to climb, because absence can be louder than shouting when trust is tipping, can't it? Vanessa's smile was lacquered thin over something feral as she kissed the air an inch from my cheek and chirped, "Colin was just leaving," while her eyes said, "Don't you dare speak before I arrange the story," and I tapped my cane once against the tile to remind myself that rhythm belongs to the drummer, not the dancer, and today I would drum, wouldn't I? Colin recovered his salesman grace and extended the folder toward me, saying, "These documents explain the partnership, Mrs. Hale, you'll see your returns were about to begin," and he glanced too quickly at Vanessa for permission like a schoolboy borrowing chalk, which told me that whatever this partnership was, she wore the tie even if he wore the blazer, and tied knots can be pulled loose if you tug the right end, can't they? "Leave it on the table," I said, and he obeyed, then turned to Vanessa with a look that pleaded and calculated at once, but she flicked her hand toward the door as if he were a waiter who had overstayed by the table, and he swallowed hard and left, his cologne lingering like a rumor on a hot wind, and rumors are only weather until they become forecasts, aren't they? When he was gone, Vanessa dropped the sweet tone like a coat and muttered, "You made a spectacle," then louder, "Do you have any idea what you've cost us?" And I let the words float past my face like gnats while I slid the folder open and saw signature pages, wire instructions, a glossy brochure for homestead ventures showing houses with names like The Willow and The Haven, none of which looked like shelter to a woman who had to count her pills by the week. And shelter is not wallpaper, is. "Where is Daniel?" I asked, and she said, "At work," too quickly, then added, "He needed space." As if space could be monetized on a spreadsheet and billed back to me at month end, and I felt a tired, steady anger stir like a kettle that has simmered too long without whistling, because grief whistles to warn you you're about to burn, doesn't it? I eased into the dining chair with my back straight and said, "Vanessa, you forged my signature," and she laughed, a brittle crackling sound, and said, "Don't be dramatic," then tried the oldest trick in the book, overflowing the room with irrelevant words about stress, opportunity, the cost of living, while not once saying the one word that matters in a house set on fire. Sorry and apologies are water on flames, while explanations are kerosene, don't you think? "I will go to the police if you do not reverse the transfers and return my pension by noon," I said, sliding my phone across the table with the complaint number already on the screen, and her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall, to the window, to the door, mapping escape routes like a fox in a henhouse, and I realized she was good not because she was smart but because she had rehearsed this, and rehearsals only improve the actor until the audience changes the script, which I was doing now. "Wasn't I?" She leaned forward, lowered her voice, and said, "You're lonely, Margaret. Don't you want us to have a future where we can take care of you properly?" And the pity in her tone was a blade disguised as a bandage, and I thought of my husband, who never once used kindness to get a discount on my dignity, and I said, "I take care of me by telling the truth," and she blinked as if the light had changed color in the room. "Because truth is a bulb you either change or live in darkness with, isn't it?" Her phone buzzed on the table, Colin again, and I watched the war flicker across her face. Pick it up and expose teamwork, ignore it and risk losing choreography, and she answered on speaker by mistake, so his voice spilled out bright and urgent. "They froze the feeder accounts too. Vanessa, you didn't say she had co-signer rights on the old line," and Vanessa stabbed the button to cut the call. But the sentence had already landed like a stone through a window. And stones don't apologize for gravity, do they? I stood, the cane and anchor, and said, "Noon," and turned for the door, and she said, If you do this, Daniel will hate you, and I looked back and said, he'll hate the light for showing him the splinters, but he'll be grateful when they're out. And my heart was pounding a drum I hadn't heard since I delivered Daniel in a storm with a midwife stuck across town, because fear and resolve share a heartbeat and demand different breaths, don't they? As I stepped onto the porch, a car pulled to the curb, Daniel's. His face pale, his jaw set, his eyes red-rimmed, and he climbed out holding a manila envelope and said, "Mom, I went by the registry." And Vanessa appeared in the doorway behind me like a shadow pretending to be a person, and the wind stilled as if the day itself were listening to the hinge squeak on our family's door. And I braced for the next sentence as if it might be a wave, because some truths don't arrive. They crash, don't they? Daniel swallowed and said, "Mom." "Vanessa, Homestead is in default," and he held up the papers that would either save or salt our earth, and Vanessa's mouth opened to shape a counterstory, but no sound came, because sometimes the air refuses to be a co-conspirator, and I thought for a wild second that I could hear the tiny crack of a crown loosening on her head, and then my phone buzzed again with a message from an unknown number. "Drop the complaint or you won't like what we make public." And my thumb hovered over callback as the porch seemed to tilt, because what could they make public that I hadn't already lived? And yet threats are written to find the soft places, aren't they? I looked up at my son and said, "Read it." And he did, voice shaking, and by the end Vanessa had gone very still, which is how hyenas look when they smell a lion in the grass, stunned by a rank bigger than their appetite, and Daniel whispered, "There's criminal exposure here," and I said quietly, "Then we'll pack our courage for a long road." And before any of us could move, a dark SUV rolled up to the curb and two men stepped out in navy jackets with the word "compliance" on the breast, and one said, "Mrs. Margaret Hale," and I nodded while Vanessa swayed, because the world had chosen its timekeeper for us, and the clock had struck noon early, hadn't it? The men introduced themselves as investigators from the bank's special compliance team, not police, but bearing the kind of clipboards that make liars trip, and they asked to speak inside. And we all moved like chess pieces into the living room where the sun fell in neat rectangles across the rug, dividing light from shadow the way choices divide before and after. And you know a living room can feel like a courtroom when truth decides to stand up, don't you? Their questions were gentle but relentless, the way rain persists until it finds the leak in a roof, and Vanessa tried to answer in paragraphs, but the man named Hartley kept returning to yes or no, as if he were closing doors she kept trying to leave open, and Daniel sat with a manila envelope on his lap, fingers white around its edges, because holding proof feels like holding a live wire. Useful and dangerous and impossible to forget, isn't it? "Mrs. Hale," Hartley said to me, "did you authorize these transfers?" And I answered steadily, "I did not." And he asked, "Did you sign this letter?" And I said, "I did not." And he nodded and made notes while the second man, Singh, tracked the timing of the wires against calendar entries pulled from Vanessa's email, and I watched Vanessa's face as she realized each excuse she'd rehearsed collided with timestamps, ID checks, IP addresses, and the dull, unsentimental memory of machinery. And machines are hard to charm, aren't they? They asked whether I felt threatened. I recalled the text from the unknown number and slid the phone to them, and Vanessa sat up straighter and said, "Anyone could have sent that," and Singh agreed mildly but added, "It came from a device linked to a Colin Drake," and the name dropped like a weight through a floor that had been painted to look like marble, and painted floors don't support dancing when the band plays too loud, do they? Hartley explained the next steps. A deep freeze on associated accounts, a referral to law enforcement if forgery was confirmed, a protective flag for my pension, and recommended that I secure a restraining order if the threats escalated. And the word sounded clinical but landed like a blanket on my shoulders, not warm exactly, but heavier than the cold. And sometimes weight is comfort when wind is trying to lift you where you don't belong, isn't it? Vanessa's eyes flashed as she pivoted to Daniel. "You're just going to sit there and let them treat your wife like a criminal?" And Daniel didn't look at her. He looked at me, then at Hartley, then at the dark rectangle of the off TV, where our warped reflections hovered like ghosts wondering which of us would be invited to stay, and he finally said, "I'm going to listen until I understand," and to a person who lives on spin, listening is an act of betrayal, isn't it? They asked about Homestead Ventures. Vanessa described a vision board of passive income and lifestyle freedom, but Hartley slid across a printout showing late payments, double bookings, and a complaint from a renter about a hidden camera in a smoke detector, which Vanessa denied with offended vigor, while Singh highlighted a clause in a loan agreement where she had pledged household income. as collateral and written my initials in a font that looked too perfect to be trembling with age, and fonts tell on forgers when hands cannot, don't they? When the investigator stepped out to make calls, Daniel stood and went to the kitchen as if to fetch water, but I saw his shoulders shake once, and I followed with my cane and my breath measured, because crying men need witness, not advice, and I touched his sleeve and said, "You were not stupid, you were in love," and he covered his face and whispered, "How did I miss it?" And I told him what my sister told me when my husband hid his symptoms for 6 months. Because you were looking at his face, not his hands. And faces can tell you hope while hands make other plans, can't they? He wiped his eyes and nodded, and when we returned, Vanessa had composed herself into dignity and announced that she was leaving for her mother's, and Hartley said softly, "We'd advise you to stay available." But she was already at the door, and Daniel didn't move to stop her, which told me that something that had been elastic was now glass, and glass can be beautiful until it shatters and then it's only sharp, isn't it? After they left, the house exhaled a silence so deep I could hear the refrigerator make the small, brave sounds of a soldier guarding a line no one else could see. And I sat because my knees were buzzing from holding back a tremor, and Daniel sat too, and we stared at the papers and I said, "We will get my pension back," and he nodded, not quite believing but wanting to. And wanting is the first seed of believing if you water it with action, isn't it? My phone rang, a number from the assisted living home, and fear stabbed me that something had happened to Edith or to the small life I had built there with my garden sign-ups and crossword circle. But it was the administrator, voice kind but firm, telling me that my rent had bounced again and they would need assurance of payment by Monday or they would have to reassess accommodations. And the humiliation swept through me like a fever. Hot and dizzying, because poverty talks to you in the old voices that raised you, even when you have worked a lifetime to never hear them again, doesn't it? I took a breath, steadied my cane and said, "We will have a cashier's check by Monday," and when I hung up I turned to Daniel and said, "We must act faster than shame," and he nodded fiercely and began making a list. Police report, emergency funds, a meeting with a legal aid clinic, and I added, "Call Grace's mother. Tell her the envelope is delayed 2 days but not lost, because I would not let a girl I had never met become collateral in our family's bad weather. And weather is always happening to someone who doesn't deserve it, isn't it?" Daniel dialed, voice steadying with each sentence he spoke into a world that would judge us by whichever words found us first, and when he hung up he said, "Mom, I'll sleep on the couch tonight," and I smiled tiredly and said, "No, you'll sleep in your bed and talk to your lawyer friend in the morning," and we both knew he would not sleep much, because vigilance is often tiredness wearing armor, and armor is heavy even on men built for it, isn't it? I gathered the folder, slipped it into my Ziploc and stood to go, and Daniel walked me to the door and hugged me with the grateful desperation of a boy rescued from a riptide, and I held him the way I did the night his fever broke at 8 and he smelled like pennies and lavender oil, and I whispered, "We will tell the truth until it becomes our shelter," and as I stepped onto the porch, a flash popped from across the street where a car window had been cracked just enough for a camera lens. And the car screeched off, and I felt the old dread twist inside me that someone would try to turn this into a spectacle. And spectacles crown villains as protagonists if you don't seize your own narration, do they? I braced my cane, turned back to Daniel and said, "Tomorrow we go to the police," and he nodded, eyes hardening into purpose, and I started down the path, and nearly collided with a woman climbing the steps, late 30s, hair pulled tight, eyes like damp ash, who said, "Mrs. Hale," in a voice I didn't know, and when I said yes she said, "I'm Julia, Colin's wife," and the porch dropped away beneath my feet as she held out a flash drive with trembling fingers and whispered, "Please, you need to see this before you go anywhere," and my heart thumped like a moth against a light, because some allies come dressed as complications, don't they? Julia sat on the edge of the couch like a visitor in her own life and clutched a tote bag that seemed to hold equal parts evidence and regret, and Daniel brought water that she didn't drink, and I sat across from her with my cane angled like a question mark, and she said, "I found these in Colin's office last night," tapping the flash drive, and I couldn't sleep because my boys were in the next room and I realized their father is not just cheating. He's stealing, and admissions have a taste. That's part salt and part metal, don't they? She told us Colin had promised a windfall from hospitality investments and then started coming home with words that didn't fit in his mouth. Escrow, arbitrage, flow-through. And when she asked simple questions, he gave complicated answers until she stopped asking. And last week the credit cards slipped into collections and he became a stranger in his own house, and strangers are not made in a day. They are carved by 1,000 small tolerated lies, aren't they? Daniel plugged the flash drive into his laptop and opened a folder titled HV Ops, and inside were spreadsheets, bank statements, scans of IDs, and a file of photos taken in restaurants, lobbies, cars. Vanessa and Colin smiling like co-founders of a humanity they didn't owe taxes to. Each picture stamped with date and location, and dates are the vertebrae of truth. They make lies stoop when they are stacked, don't they? One spreadsheet caught my eye. Feederness with columns for source, amount, and mask story, and next to my name in neat lines were the entries. Household consolidation, password support, elder tech assist, and the mask stories read like lullabies whispered to conscience, and I felt a cold clarity settle in my bones that had nothing to do with winter and everything to do with stepping into a river that has carved the same path for years, because predators recycle scripts until someone refuses to play along, don't they? Julia covered her face, ashamed by guilt that wasn't hers, and I reached across the coffee table and touched her knuckles and said, "Thank you," with a kind of sincerity that knits in midair between women who have seen the backdrop fall and are still alive on stage, and she nodded, crying without sound, because sound would have shaken the room into splinters, and sometimes quiet tears do the heavy lifting of a flood, don't they? The file labeled Collateral contained recordings. My breath tightened as Daniel clicked one and we heard Vanessa's voice, clear and crisp, say, "If she makes trouble, we threaten to take it public. She hates pity. Use the pictures from the home, the ones where she fell." And a male voice, Colin, chuckled and said, "Old people don't sue, they die." And I felt the rage rise, hot and clean, and then cool into purpose, cold and sharp. Because indignation is a match but strategy is a lamp, isn't it? Daniel paused the audio and looked at me, eyes asking, "Are you okay?" And I nodded because I have lived through funerals, through bedside vigils, through months of bills that fit like handcuffs, and I knew this rage could ruin me or refine me. And refinement is painful, but it leaves edges that cut only what should be cut, doesn't it? We copied the files to an external drive, and I wrote the time and date on a sticky note because details comfort me the way a straight line comforts a quilter, and when Julia stood to leave she said, "I don't know what will happen to me when he finds out," and I said, "You will be safer in truth than in his protection," and she nodded because sometimes faith is a sentence you borrow until it becomes your own voice, isn't it? We drove to the police station with a folder, the flash drive, and a steadiness that felt engineered by grief and arithmetic, and the duty officer listened longer than I expected and shorter than I wanted, then called a detective who ushered us into a room with gray chairs and a wall clock that ticked like a metronome for courage, and we told the story not as a soap opera but as a ledger, line by line. And ledgers persuade people who have heard too many sobs and too few facts, don't they? The detective, a woman named Price with kind crow's feet and impatient eyebrows, watched the recording twice, then stood and said, "We'll need sworn statements and we'll coordinate with the bank," and she turned to Daniel and asked if he understood the marital implications, and he nodded with the dignity of a man signing consent for a necessary surgery. And surgeries save lives even when they leave scars, don't they? She took photographs of my ID, of the forged letter, of my trembling hands which I asked her not to capture and she didn't, and she warned us that this could get loud. Civil filings, criminal inquiries, maybe press if it spills that way, and I said, "I have lived quietly for decades, but quiet did not protect my pension," and she smiled sadly because she knows that quiet is a virtue until it becomes a muzzle, and muzzles look like manners when you buy them on sale, don't they? That night I returned to the assisted living home and found a white envelope slipped under my door. No stamp, no name. Inside, a single photograph of me on the bus yesterday, mouth set, eyes forward, and on the back in block letters, "Go back to your rocking chair." And the threat was so juvenile it almost made me laugh, but cruelty's diction is often childish, and childish things become felonies when they put on adult shoes, don't they? I called Detective Price to log it and she said, "Good, every breadcrumb." And I sat on my bed and breathed until the ceiling stopped looking like a lid and started looking like a roof, and I whispered my husband's name into the dark like a sailor checking his compass, and the room answered with radiator clicks and the soft hum of televisions in distant rooms where other elders were watching game shows. And I thought about how each of us is an episode to someone else and an entire season to ourselves, and I promised to give my season a strong finale, didn't I? In the morning, the administrator knocked and asked gently about the rent. I placed a cashier's check on her clipboard. Daniel had hustled like a man with a deadline stitched to his pride. And she smiled, relieved, and I felt the small, fragile dignity of paying for my own roof take root again. And roots are stubborn when watered by humiliation that refuses to be permanent, aren't they? On my way to the dining room, Vanessa appeared in the hallway of my home, uninvited, wearing sunglasses like a celebrity escaping from a truth she hadn't paid for, and she leaned close and hissed, "Call off your dogs," and I said, "My dogs are called Law and Arithmetic," and the nurse behind the desk called security, and Vanessa slipped away with a laugh that cracked like thin ice under a careless boot. And thin ice never looks thin until it's under you, does it? That afternoon, Detective Price called to say Colin had been picked up on a traffic stop linked to a bench warrant for an unrelated property code violation. And while in custody he had tried to access his cloud account, which had pinged an alert right to her desk thanks to the compliance team's watch, and she said, "Sometimes the universe helps." And I thought, no, sometimes people do their jobs in a way that looks like a miracle from far away. And I decided to stand closer to competence from now on, wouldn't you? Then she said, "There's something else, you should prepare yourself," and the quiet stretched until it felt like the space between lightning and thunder, and she added, "We found an unauthorized loan application with your name and a fake medical consent suggesting cognitive decline to justify power of attorney," and my breath left me in a soft, stunned sound, because theft of money is a slap, but theft of capacity is an erasure, and erasures make history look like a rumor, don't they? I sat very still, the phone warm against my ear, and said, "How do we fight that?" And she said, "With documentation of your independence, medical assessments and witnesses." And I thought of Edith, of the garden committee, of the crossword circle, of the administrator who had watched me balance embarrassment and resolve, and I realized my life had been recording my competence all along, in pencil lines across ordinary days. And ordinary days become affidavits when you need them to, don't they? "Begin tonight," she said. "Write a timeline, dates, receipts, names." And I laughed softly because she had just given a retired bursar a homework assignment in the language of her bones, and when I hung up, I sharpened a pencil I had been saving and drew a line at the top of a notebook page and wrote, "The day Vanessa called me useless," and under it, "The day I froze their accounts," and under it, "Tomorrow." And I felt something unclench in my chest, because a timeline is a spine for a story that refuses to slouch, and I will not slouch for thieves, will I? I woke before dawn with the old habit of a woman who has spent her life waking before needs can name themselves, and I made tea, black and steady, and began my timeline while the sky peeled itself from night like a stubborn sticker, and words found me with the exactness of ledger lines. Dates, amounts, names, places, the texture of the teller's voice, the click of my cane, the shiver in Daniel's breath, because memory becomes more precise when purpose tightens its belt, doesn't it? At 9, the administrator organized a small room for statements and witnesses. Edith arrived first in a cardigan that had seen more laughter than most living rooms, and she said, "If anyone asks whether you keep your wits in a cupboard, I'll show them where you keep the extra Scrabble tiles." And I laughed, then cried, then laughed again, because friendship is a hand that keeps turning the dial until the combination of your courage clicks, isn't it? 2 aides testified that I take my own meds, manage my keys, sign my forms, run the garden schedule with a precision that scares tomatoes into ripening, and their affection braided itself with their observations until the rope felt strong enough to pull a small boat back to shore, and I realized that community is not a soft word. It is hard work that produces soft landings, and soft landings save brittle bones, don't they? Detective Price collected the statements, arranged for a medical evaluation that afternoon, and assured me that the power of attorney gambit would collapse under the weight of its own lazy lies, and I felt relief lean against me like a tired child who could finally nap because the grown-ups had arrived, and then my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. She moved out, and the words were both a loss and a relief, because departures reshuffle the furniture of a life whether or not you ordered new chairs, don't they? He arrived an hour later with hollow cheeks, kissed my forehead and said, "I filed for separation," and the words sat between us like early snow on a spring garden, unavoidable and unseasonal but real, and he said, "I keep hearing her calling you useless and my chest burns," and I said, "That burn is called clarity. Blow on it gently, it will become heat for your real life," and he smiled sadly because metaphors are warm, but forms must still be filled, and we filled them, didn't we? The evaluation went smoothly. The doctor asked me to spell a word backward, to count by sevens from 100, to draw a clock, and I did each task with the precision of a woman who had once balanced a district's school accounts with a pencil and an eraser, and when he finished he said, "Mrs. Hale, your mind is a well-maintained library." And I whispered thanks to the stacks of crosswords and book club arguments that kept the shelves dusted. Because libraries don't keep themselves, do they? Back at my room, a plain envelope waited with a typed note. "Last chance, withdraw the complaint or the video goes live," and a link, and my hand shook just a little as I opened a browser on the facility computer and entered the address, and a clip loaded of me at the bank lobby. Vanessa's audio edited to sound like a plea and my silence cut to look like cruelty, and the caption read, "Elderly woman scams her own family. Shocking." And my stomach flipped because lies are quicker than truth when dressed for clicks, aren't they? I printed the page for evidence, called Price, and she said, "We'll work on having it pulled. Send me the link and don't engage." And I nodded even though she couldn't see, because engagement is oxygen for small fires that think they're bonfires, and I would not feed what I intended to stamp out with paperwork and courage looks boring until it wins, doesn't it? We scheduled a preliminary hearing for a protective order, and the court date hit the calendar like a nail, fixed and glinting, and that night I lay awake listening to the hall whispers, my neighbors discussing birthdays and back pain and bingo while my head counted risks and receipts, and around 3 in the morning, I remembered the tiny safe deposit box I had kept from my Bursa days, the one with a ring of my husband's and a few bonds and, my breath caught, copies of my original pension setup, documents with signatures and notary seals, and original things frown at forgeries like elders at misbehaving children, don't they? In the morning, Daniel drove me to the bank where I extracted the thin folder that smelled faintly of old office and lemon oil, and when I laid those notary stamps beside the forged letter at Detective Price's desk, she smiled the way a builder smiles when the final brick clicks into place, and she said, "This will help the prosecutor decide quickly. And quickness is kindness when you've already waited through years of covert erosion, isn't it?" At lunchtime, Julia texted from a shelter she'd checked into with her boys. She had filed for a restraining order after Colin called her 24 times in one night, and I replied, "Proud of you," and sent her a photo of my garden waiting list like a joke about abundance, and she sent back a photo of her sons eating peanut butter with spoons, eyes bright, and we shared a tiny, fierce joy because safety sometimes looks like plastic cutlery and fluorescent lighting and a door that locks, and survivals have strange wallpaper, don't they? That afternoon, as I pruned the herb beds behind the home, Vanessa appeared on the other side of the fence, sunglasses again, voice flat, and said, "You think you've won because you have a badge on your side," and I said, "No, I think I've begun," and she smiled like a cracked bowl pretending to hold soup and said, "Everyone will know you destroyed your son's marriage," and the shame tried to curl my shoulders, but I kept my spine high because shame is a loan fraudsters take out in your name and expect you to pay interest on, and I am defaulting on that debt today, aren't I? She leaned closer and whispered, "You're old, Margaret, courts move slowly," and I smiled gently and said, "So do glaciers, and they redraw continents," and she flinched as if the word had a sharp edge, and left without looking back, and I exhaled a laugh that tasted like peppermint because Edith had slipped a sweet in my pocket that morning and told me, "Use sugar as ammunition," and I was beginning to understand how, wasn't I? At dusk, Daniel called to say he'd found a storage unit rented by Homestead in town and asked if he should tell Price, and I said, "Yes, and do not go alone," and he said, "I won't," and an hour later he sent a trembling voice note. "Mum, they found boxes, contracts, cameras, a ledger marked family," and the way he said the last word made my throat close because to some predators family is merely a category on a spreadsheet labeled low-risk targets. And targets learn to move or they learn to roar, don't they? We met Price at the unit. She photographed, catalogued, sealed, and told us to go home and sleep, which we tried. And somewhere after midnight I drifted into a dream of my husband teaching Daniel to ride a bicycle, running behind him with a hand on the seat until the boy found his balance, and the hand let go and the boy didn't notice for a glorious second. And I woke with tears in my ears and a certainty blooming in my chest that I had done the same thing today with something heavier than handlebars, and balance is loud when it first arrives, isn't it? The next morning brought a call from Price that the prosecutor would file charges for forgery, fraud, and coercion by threat, and I sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "Thank you," to no one and to everyone, and then she added, "There's a warrant for Vanessa's arrest. And I closed my eyes because I had wanted justice, not spectacle, but sometimes justice wears boots and knocks on doors. And you cannot ask it to change shoes for your comfort, can you? I told Daniel, and he said nothing for a long time, then whispered, I am still grateful for the good years, and I said, you can be grateful and still walk away, and he said, I will, and gratitude and boundaries looked at each other across a small table and nodded, and somewhere in that nod a life lesson wrote itself. Love without boundaries is charity that feeds wolves, and wolves burp, not thank, don't they? Courtrooms are colder than truth and warmer than mercy, and the waiting benches are designed to make everyone equal at the level of discomfort, which is fair even if it isn't kind. And Daniel and I sat shoulder to shoulder while Price spoke to the prosecutor, and the defense attorney scanned a phone as if texts might become precedent if scrolled vigorously enough, and I thought, in a world that loves fast emotions, paperwork is our only poetry that lasts. And I have always been good with stanzas. Made of forms, haven't I? Vanessa entered with a lawyer in a suit that looked rented and a face set to righteously wounded, and she did not look at us, perhaps because our eyes would not support her narrative, and the judge, a woman with salt hair and a voice like a well-tuned cello, asked for brief arguments, and the prosecutor summarized the forgeries, the threats, the feeder accounts, the recordings, and then offered exhibits that clicked into evidence like bones into a spine. And spines help a body stand even under heavy weather, don't they? Vanessa's lawyer attempted theater about misunderstandings and family tensions, but the judge lifted a hand and said, Counselor, save emotion for sentencing. Today is about probable cause, and he pivoted to technicalities, which the prosecutor answered with timestamps and notary seals and the letter of the law. And letters are picky friends who help when you feed them exactly what they want, aren't they? When asked if I wished to speak, I stood with my cane and said, I want what is mine returned, my name unsmudged, and a path cleared so that no other grandmother must learn how to spell affidavit with this much urgency. And the courtroom rustled quietly, and I sat, heart like a rabbit and like a drum, because vulnerability and resolve sometimes wear the same shoes, don't they? The judge granted the protective order and authorized the charges to proceed, and set a hearing date that felt too far and somehow just right, and as we left, a reporter in a sensible coat asked me for comment and I said, Numbers do not lie even when people do, then added, Kindness is not a power of attorney, and she blinked, surprised to receive a sentence instead of a sob. And perhaps this will help someone else pack a sentence for their own fight, won't it? Outside, a small crowd had gathered, and I recognized Julia leaning against a pillar with her boys, who were drawing superheroes with crayons on scrap paper, and she hugged me with the fierce gratitude of someone who followed her fear to the door and discovered courage waiting there with a spare key, and she said, The shelter helped me find an apartment, and I felt a joy so clean it squeaked inside my ribs, because fresh starts sometimes smell like disinfectant and hope, don't they? That evening Daniel and I drove to his house to collect what Vanessa had left, a few boxes of clothes, a bottle of perfume, a framed print that said, Hustle and Heart, which now read like a confession of which part she'd valued more, and the silence in the rooms was not emptiness but possibility, the way a classroom feels the day before school starts when the light angles differently across barren desks, and you can almost hear future laughter, can't you? We scrubbed the kitchen not because it was dirty but because cleaning is an exorcism that smells like lemon, and we made a list of small repairs that had been ignored, nails that had backed out of wood, a cabinet hinge that sighed, and fixing things was a language we both knew, our hands remembering how to translate love into service without keeping invoices, and some languages make you fluent again as soon as you speak them, don't they? A week later, the bank notified us that most of my pension had been recovered from the frozen accounts. I went in person to collect a bank check because I wanted to feel the weight of restitution in my palm, and the teller, her lipstick a brave coral, slipped it across with a small smile and said, I told my grandmother about you, and I laughed softly and said, Tell her to label her envelopes. And we shared an understanding that felt like a quilt stitched from strangers' good intentions. And quilts warm rooms bigger than beds, don't they? I walked straight from the bank to the post office and mailed Grace's school fees with a note that said, Finish what you start, and I slid a second envelope to the garden committee for winter seedlings, and a third to Julia labeled Deposit, which made my fingers tingle because helping is only sweet when it does not steal tomorrow from someone else, and stealing tomorrow is the only theft I truly fear, isn't it? That night, I stood in the home's common room where the television showed a talent show judged by people who had never had to choose between soup and soap, and I asked the activity coordinator if I could start a weekly paperwork power hour. teaching the residents how to read statements, set alerts, and draw boundaries in the shape of signatures, and she clapped her hands and said, "Yes," and I felt a new kind of usefulness unfurl inside me like a banner that had been rolled up during bad weather, and banners deserve parades when the sun returns, don't they? Our first session filled the small library. Edith passed out biscuits like communion, and I lectured with humor because laughter lowers fear and makes room for knowledge to sit down. And the residents told stories of nephews with new business ideas, of caregivers who helped by taking cards to the store, of passwords that migrated into other people's pockets, and we practiced saying, "No, not cruelly but clearly," the way one closes a gate before a fox arrives. And gates are not rude, they are architecture for love, aren't they? 2 days later, a package arrived with no return address. Inside, a tiny recorder and a note. "For your classes. Press once to record, again to save." And I smiled because someone in Price's office had a good memory and a better heart, and tools given to elders are seeds planted in deeper soil than most people realize. And deep soil bears fruit even in late seasons, doesn't it? Then, of course, came the backlash. A cousin I hadn't heard from in years messaged, "You didn't have to ruin her life." And I stared at the screen until the words rearranged themselves into their true meaning. "Your boundaries inconvenience my storytelling," and I replied, "I ruined the plan to spend my life slowly," and blocked him, and the relief that came with that tap was a sermon I would preach to anyone who asked. That blocking is not violence. It is gardening, and gardens thrive when you pull the weeds early, don't they? The preliminary news broke. A blog ran a headline that was mercifully accurate. My neighbors printed it and taped it to the bulletin board with a handwritten, "Go, Margaret." And I blushed like a schoolgirl, then laughed at myself because at 72 my blush now looks like a kind sunrise, and sunrises belong to those who keep waking up even when the night has told them 1,000 times to stay down, don't they? And then a voicemail from Vanessa. Her voice stripped of lacquer, raw like a knee after a fall. "I'm pregnant," she said, a sentence tossed like a grenade into a room she hoped would duck, and my breath left me not because I doubted or believed but because every new life is both joy and arithmetic would not change today. Restitution owed, harm done, boundaries drawn, and I knew this would complicate the path like a storm over a detour. And storms cannot be negotiated with, only prepared for, right? I called Daniel and told him about the voicemail, and he went very quiet, the way a field goes quiet before a bird takes flight, and then he said, "If it's true, I'll take responsibility. If it's manipulation, I'll take the test results." And I felt pride settle on my shoulders like a shawl my mother once knit. Heavy, warm, worn by women who have faced weather and still attended to the stove, and I said, "We will stand in the truth together and it will hold." And he said, "Even if it's a boy who will ask hard questions one day." And I said, "Especially then, because children deserve timelines, not fairy tales that hide the wolves behind velvet, don't they?" Price arranged for a supervised meeting where Vanessa delivered a sonogram photo as if it were a ceasefire treaty, eyes flicking to gauge whether the image changed the charges, and it did not. It only changed the furniture in Daniel's heart, which now had to accommodate a crib beside the gavel. And hearts are capacious when guided by integrity, aren't they? We agreed on interim support channeled through legal accounts, not hand-to-hand where manipulation collects change and calls it charity. And Vanessa sneered that I was turning her baby into a court docket, and I said gently, "No, I am turning your choices into paper where accountability lives." And she turned away because paper doesn't flinch when accused of cruelty by those who fear ink. And fear of ink is common among those who prefer whispers, isn't it? In the midst of this, my paperwork power hour bloomed. Residents brought nieces and neighbors, and we role-played doctor visits, bank calls, and the dreaded, "Let me help you with your passwords," until voices that had trembled now tried out firmness like a new pair of shoes, and some shoes pinch at first but become the ones you reach for when walking far, don't they? Grace sent me a letter with careful handwriting thanking me for the fees and telling me she had placed first in mathematics, and I cried in the laundry room so no one would see. Not from sadness but from relief that even in this storm, I was still watering the garden rose I had promised myself to tend. And gardens whisper back louder than storms when you kneel close enough, don't they? The prosecutor offered Vanessa a plea. Restitution, probation, a ban on financial authority over elders for 10 years, community service teaching ethics at a program she had once mocked. And she balked because vanity hates uniforms, even volunteer ones, and a trial date loomed like a mountain in fog. And mountains are not impressed by speeches about misunderstood intentions, are they? Julia's divorce progressed. She got the apartment with laminate floors and a balcony where her boys lined up toy cars like a parade. And she started a bookkeeping course because she said numbers made her feel safe now that she could read them in her own voice. And I sent her flashcards with terms and doodles. And we laughed that we were building a small army of women armed with calculators and boundaries. And armies like ours win wars no one writes history books about, don't they? At the next hearing, the judge asked Vanessa if she understood the offer. She looked at her lawyer, then at Daniel, then at her own hands as if they might volunteer to be someone kinder, and finally nodded, and the collected breath in the room released, but then she added, "As long as Margaret apologizes publicly." And the judge's eyebrows rose slowly, and the prosecutor coughed into a fist, and I realized Vanessa would rather crawl across asphalt than allow the story to exist without me seeing her last, pretty frame. And pretty frames do not hold rotten pictures for long, do they? I stood, leaning on my cane, and said, "I will say this publicly. I forgive the parts of you that are simply fear wearing theft like a costume, but I do not apologize for drawing a line where my dignity begins." And the judge's mouth curved the way a teacher's does when a student earns a point no one else knew was on the test, and Vanessa flushed. And sometimes flushing is the first honest color that visits a liar's face in months, isn't it? After court, Daniel and I walked to the car under a sky the exact sober blue of a police uniform, and he said, "I thought marriage would be the shelter forever," and I said, "Sometimes marriage is the weather and the shelter is your values." And he nodded, and we stood a long time beside the car without speaking, because silence is sometimes a benediction when words have done enough heavy lifting for one day, isn't it? The night before sentencing, Vanessa texted a simple, "I'm scared," and I stared at the screen and felt a complicated sorrow, the kind that arrives not for the choices but for the child a person once was before someone taught her that love is a ledger to be gamed, and I typed, "Tell the truth and let it rebuild you," then deleted it and typed, "Your fear can be a map if you stop calling it a weapon," and sent it. And whether she would read it as mercy or malice was no longer my work, and releasing work that isn't yours is its own kind of tithe, isn't it? At dawn, I found a note slid under my door. Not a threat, a thank you. From a resident who had told her grandson no and kept her car title, and she wrote, "Your class saved me $22,000. And I held the paper to my chest because victory usually arrives unannounced and wearing ordinary clothes, and I am learning to recognize its gate even without drums, aren't I? Sentencing day, the courtroom held less drama than anyone on the internet would click for. There were no gasps, only paperwork, measured words, a child's quiet whimper somewhere in the back, and the judge listing terms like beadwork, restitution, probation, community service, financial education, no contact without counsel, and a stern warning about any attempts to manipulate public perception with doctored videos. And stern warnings are scaffolds around buildings that might yet be saved, aren't they? Vanessa glanced back at us as deputies guided her to processing. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw a young woman at my kitchen table laughing in a sky-blue cardigan I once gifted her. And grief rose for that version of her the world will not get back. And grief is allowed a seat at victory's table as long as it doesn't try to carve the roast, isn't it? Outside, the same reporter asked if I had a message for other elders, and I said, "Stay gentle, not gullible. Stay loving, not lenient. And if someone calls you useless, let them find out how useful your spine is." And she smiled with all her teeth because quotable lines make editors kinder, and I did not say the rest aloud. That usefulness is not measured by how much of yourself you give away but by how faithfully you guard what was entrusted to you. And guard duty can be holy work, can't it? We drove home in a quiet that felt like clean sheets, simple, earned, cool on overheated skin. And Daniel asked if he could come to my class next week and bring coffee, and I said, "Bring biscuits too." And we laughed together like people whose lungs had finally remembered their full capacity. And laughter at the end of a hard season sounds like a promise rehearsing itself, doesn't it? When I reached my room, a new envelope awaited. This one with a return address from Grace's school, a certificate of appreciation for supporting a future mathematician, and I framed it and hung it where the print about family had once been. And it fit better because this saying had been stitched by deeds, not purchased by hope, and deeds hang straighter than platitudes, don't they? And then, because life insists on being itself even at the end of a chapter, the fire alarm trilled from someone's burnt toast down the hall, and we all shuffled out in our robes, laughing and complaining, and Edith leaned into me and whispered, "You are very useful, my dear, especially when the world is on fire." and the smoke cleared, and the sky beyond the parking lot glowed the color of ripe pears. And I decided it was time to write the ending that had been waiting patiently all along, wasn't? I promised you an ending, not a fairy tale, and up close they rarely differ except that endings require you to hold two truths at once. That justice can feel like grief wearing a uniform, and that healing sometimes looks like a calendar filled with small, faithful appointments, and my calendar for the next month carried both. The steady march of community service hours Vanessa would attend without my gaze, and the bright circle around the day Daniel and I planted rosemary and thyme in the homes. Garden boxes, because rosemary remembers and thyme insists. And together they season what would otherwise be bland, don't they? Daniel fixed the hinge on my wardrobe door and hung a shelf for my books, and each small repair felt like a vow, not to me but to himself, that he would build rather than hustle, tend rather than leverage. And at dinner he announced to the table of elders that he was starting a volunteer clinic on weekends to help families read contracts before signing them. And the table erupted in applause that sounded like hail on a tin roof, loud, small, relentless, and somehow joyous, and hail nourishes. Some soils it dense, doesn't it? Julia passed her first bookkeeping exam and sent a picture of her certificate taped to the wall alongside her boys' crayon superheroes, and she wrote, "Numbers feel like a language I always knew but no one taught me to name," and I printed it and put it in my class folder under a tab labeled Proof of Blooming. And the tab got fat quickly because bloom is stubborn in good soil even if hail has visited. And stubbornness is a virtue when it grows fruit, isn't it? Grace sent me a postcard with a drawing of a rocket and the equation for escape velocity, and I laughed until I cried because the child I sponsor is teaching me physics at 72, and the physics of my life now are simple. Every force that tries to reduce me meets an equal and opposite refusal, and my refusal has numbers and friends and a detective with eyebrows that can lift truth out of mud. And mud is only dirt with too much water until you decide to shape it into bricks. Don't you think? Vanessa began her community service at a financial literacy nonprofit where she first arrived rigid with disdain and eventually loosened by the relentless sincerity of people who show up on Tuesdays with plastic folders and too much to lose, and I did not watch her. I did not send her messages. I did not check her progress online, because healing requires boundaries that protect both sides from poisoning the well, and exiles can be the kindest thing you do for a person who wielded your home as a weapon, can't they? She sent one letter through her attorney requesting that my statement at sentencing be shared with her in full. I allowed it, and he later passed on a single line from her reply. I didn't know the line was there, and I thought that is the problem and the beginning of its solution, because lines do not move unseen when you teach people to trace them with their own hands, and my classes would draw more lines this month with rulers, humor, and biscuits are study aids more powerful than most syllabi admit, aren't they? And then the thing I had been dreading and preparing for arrived in the simplest possible wrapping. A phone call in mid-afternoon, Daniel's voice soft and astonished. "Mum, it's a girl," and a laugh that I had not heard in a year cracked open the air between us like good thunder after a dry season, and he added, "She's healthy," and grief tried to elbow its way in. Grief for the marriage that broke, for the lies that strutted around our kitchen pretending to be bread. But joy stood first at the door, and I stood with it. Because joy deserves first refusal on days like this, doesn't it? He asked if I wanted to see her. We arranged a supervised visit with a social worker present, and I held the baby while the worker made notes and the clock made small sounds and the world held its breath, and I whispered, "You will learn numbers that tell the truth and people who behave like numbers," and she wrinkled her nose and made a sound that could have been laughter or wind, and I decided to assume laughter because assumptions are seeds too when planted carefully, aren't they? On the way home, I asked Daniel what he would name her and he said, "Evelyn," after my sister who once told me to become a wall before my son walked off a cliff, and I nodded, and we drove in silence that glittered with tiny, quiet fireworks you cannot see unless you have learned to celebrate dignities that do not trend, and dignities like these rebuild cities made of families, don't they? The following Tuesday at Paperwork Power Hour, I wrote 3 sentences on the whiteboard. Dignity is not negotiable. Generosity is not governance. Kindness is not consent, and the room hummed like a hive discovering its queen was the work, not the bee, and we practiced saying these out loud until the words felt like keys in our mouths, and keys are a sound the locked door recognizes, aren't they? A month later, the restitution check cleared fully. I divided a portion into 3 envelopes. rent in advance, Grace's next 2 terms, and a modest holiday fund for the residents to throw the kind of party that reminds us all we are not merely surviving, we are choosing, we are singing, we are laughing at magic tricks performed by a volunteer whose hands are quicker than our eyes but not quicker than our delight. And delight is currency thieves cannot counterfeit, isn't it? I went back to the bank where this all began and brought the teller a small potted rosemary with a ribbon, and she cried a little and said, "I'm leaving for nursing school." And I hugged her because growth had decided to happen for more than one of us before the credits rolled, and credits should feature all the names, even the ones who held doors or stamped forms with care, because bureaucrats with hearts are unsung choreographers of justice, aren't they? We had our holiday party in the common room strung with lights that made the oldest faces look briefly like their own grandchildren, and Edith insisted on reading a poem she wrote that rhymed affidavit with brave it. And we clapped and pretended the slant rhyme was perfect because affection fixes meter the way solder fixes a leak, and fixed leaks save ships on nights when the stars hide, don't they? Near the end of the evening, the administrator asked if I would say a few words, and I stood with my cane and said, "My name is Margaret Hale, I am 72, and I was called useless by someone who wanted a shortcut through my dignity, but the shortest path to any future worth living is through the long, steady work of choosing truth." And the room murmured agreement the way pines murmur when wind picks a direction, and I added, "I froze their accounts, but what I really did was thaw my own voice." And a hush fell that felt like a blessing testing its echo, doesn't it? I looked around at the faces, lined, soft, defiant, luminous, and said, "Our lesson is not revenge but restoration. Restore your name with boundaries, restore your roof with receipts, restore your heart with communities that clap for your paperwork and your poems." And they laughed through tears and someone shouted, "Useful," and the room took it up like a chant. And I laughed so hard my ribs hurt because I had not known how much I needed to hear that word turned right side up by people who meant it, and words can be healed when communities decide to correct them, can't they? Later, when the lights dimmed and the room emptied and I was left with a few cups to stack and a song that refused to leave my head, I stood at the window and watched frost begin to silver the grass and thought of Vanessa somewhere working a shift she did not want at a place that taught the kind of arithmetic she had once mocked, and I wished for her the hard mercy that had saved me. A boundary to press against until it became a backbone, and a child who would someday know the difference between help and harm because adults had learned to spell it for her in the language of deeds. And language like that will outlive us if we speak it often enough, won't it? I went to my room and set my cane by the door and smoothed the coverlet and placed the certificate from Grace's school beside the photo of my husband holding baby Daniel under a sky that had not yet known our storms, and I whispered, "We did it. Not to boast but to mark the road, and marking roads is how other travelers find their way when the fog wants them to turn back. And no one should turn back from a future where their name is theirs again, should they? So here is our ending, and here is your invitation. If anyone calls you useless, cash their insult at the counter where truth pays interest, and let your spine sign the receipt. And if anyone takes what you need to live, freeze what feeds them and warm what feeds you, and laugh with your friends and plant rosemary, and keep receipts in Ziplocs, and remember that kindness without clarity is a hole in your pocket, and pockets hold coins that send girls to school and pay for seed and strawberries and small, holy parties where elders dance slowly and clap on the beat, because they earned the right to set the rhythm, didn't they?